Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's plenary. My name is Tom Carmichael. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western, and it is my very great pleasure this evening to introduce Panagiotis Sotiris. Panagiotis and I have known each other for the best part of a decade, I guess, through our work on the militant philosopher Louis Althusser. I don't think either one of us could count the number of times we've appeared on panels together. But for me, it's really been my great fortune, a chance to get to know and respect Panagiotis' superb scholarship. He really is one of the great Althusser scholars in the globe. He's currently a researcher at the Laboratory of Arts and Cultural Management of the Department of Communications and Media Studies at the University of Athens. He's taught social and political philosophy at the University of Crete, Panteion University, and the University of the Aegean. He's the author of innumerable articles, and I will say innumerable articles on Althusser and Antonio Gramsci. Many of them have appeared in the journal Historical Materialism. He's also the author of the book Communism and Philosophy, the Theoretical Adventure of Louis Althusser, which appeared in Greek in 2004. And he has a forthcoming book from the HM book series on Althusser, which will appear, Panagiotis, soon, right? Yeah, soon, okay. Panagiotis has also been very much an engaged scholar, public intellectual. He's been active, and it's in that mode he's speaking to us tonight. He's been active and for decades on the Greek left and in social struggles in Greece, and he's a respected and prolific contributor to public debates. A former member of Antarsya, and more recently, of course, of Popular Unity. It's my great pleasure and ours to have him here this evening. The title of his talk is How Do We Create a People, Rethinking Resistance, Solidarity, and Transformation in the European South. Please welcome Panagiotis Sotiris.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and for the invitation to participate in this conference. And I would like to say that if movements and activism need also to be learning places, such conferences are necessary venues to enable exactly this kind of a learning process. So thanks a lot basically for being here. I mean, I've learned a lot of things, and I'll try to share with you some of the experiences and the lessons from the Greek struggles. So, what I'm going to present comes from the very particular experience of confronting the austerity and erosion of democracy resulting from the embedded neoliberalism of the European integration process in the context of the post-2007 global capitalist crisis. In Greece, the structural inequalities across Europe as a result of the introduction of the single currency in an area marked by important divergences in productivity and competitiveness, combined with a global recession, took the form of a debt crisis without precedent, which was also the result of the structural contradictions of Greek capitalism, which included a debt-driven growth since the mid-1990s, the constant stimulus of state spending for construction, a fragmented labor market and relatively cheap immigrant labor, privatizations, and a certain version of consumerist hedonism to a large extent financed by debt. Consequently, the Greek crisis was like the combination of the crisis of the Eurozone, the global economic crisis, and a crisis of the hegemonic narrative of Greek capital, namely capitalist modernization by means of attachment to the European project. Greece's appeal to the European Union and the European Central Bank and the IMF for assistance in early 2010 led to bailout programs that combined the social aggression of the IMF structural adjustment programs in Latin America with the logic of limited sovereignty inherent in the EU institutional framework. A combination of fear that Greece could be a moral danger for the European economies, along with the desire to set an example, led to austerity programs that were like violent counter-revolutions from above. The imposition of a constant evaluation process with bailout funding being conditional upon positive evaluation regarding the implementation of austerity and neoliberal reforms has since been the practical manifestation of reduced sovereignty, and we are currently in the middle of such a process of evaluation in Greece. This situation created a social and political crisis without precedent. It led to a protest and contestation sequence of almost insurrectionary character in 2010 until 2012. Of particular importance, it was the movement of the squares in 2011, which coincided with a global cycle of protests from Tahrir Square to New York. In Greece, it had the particular significance of being a moment of convergence between those persons that had already been active in protests, such as militants of the left, trade union activists, student union activists, with the people with no prior political engagement. This created a new form of collective identity in struggle, new public spheres, and a new interest in radical politics and alternatives. The combined result of extreme deterioration of social conditions and mass political mobilization was what we could describe as a crisis of hegemony, leading to tectonic shifts in relations of political representation. PASOK, the Socialist Party, a very stable until then mass social democratic party, imploded. The center-right New Democracy suffered important losses, and Syriza, a relatively small left-wing party, had a meteoric rise, while at the same time there was an impressive increase in votes for the neo-Nazi Golden Dawn. Now, despite the tremendous energy expressed by the protest movement in 2010 until 2012, it was obvious that without a political rupture, there could be no exit from austerity. The traditional mechanism of protest, forcing a government to seek compromise, was not functioning in what can only be described as a post-democratic condition. Hence, the turn towards Syriza in the hope of an anti-austerity government that would represent this political rupture. When the new government was elected in January 2015, it faced from the beginning a very aggressive stance from the European Union, but since Syriza had already ruled out exiting the Eurozone and stoppage of debt payments, considering both disastrous eventualities, it opted for a negotiation with the Troika. The aggressive demands from the part of Greece's creditors led to the negotiation to an impasse during the summer of 2015. The Greek government called for a swift referendum on the Troika proposals. The Greek electorate, in a tremendous expression of defiance, massively voted against the proposals. This was the no vote, the όχι vote, as it is remembered, one of the biggest collective expressions of determination from the subaltern classes in recent Greek history, and in one of the most class-polarized electoral confrontations we've seen. However, soon afterwards, some days afterwards, the Greek government capitulated and accepted a new memorandum, that is, a new austerity package with even more aggressive proposals than the previous ones. Having won the September 2015 elections, Syriza continues to be the main governing party, implementing, however, austerity measures. Now, I just gave this small introduction just to have an historical context. The current social and political situation in Greece bears the signs of defeat and disillusionment coming out of the previous sequence, although there are still important resistances active, exemplified in the continuous movement of solidarity to refugees, in the battles regarding housing debt, in anti-fascism, and attempts to revitalize the labor movement, although for a much, much more difficult starting point. Politically, this situation is expressed in a certain disillusionment with the organized left and a crisis of the organized left in most of its forms, including the return of various forms of sectarianism. Although Greece has been in a certain way unique in this sequence, there have been also other examples of political crisis and transformation in the European context. In Spain, a similar wave of social discontent against austerity and the political system fueled the emergence of Podemos, which is in the face of dealing with its own internal contradictions, oscillating between movement radicalism and political realism. In Italy, we have seen the expression of a very contradictory populist movement, the Five Stars, along with an intense political crisis, which also took the form of a rejection of a constitutional reform. yet with a particular characteristic in Italy of the absence of a direct political representation in a more radical or progressive direction. In France, we have seen at the same time mass political mobilization despite the authoritarian anti-terrorist turn of the French state, which was very evident in the mobilization against the Les Lois du Travail, along with a very important Nuit debout movement of reappropriating public space, a space of protest. But at the same time, we have seen the rise of the far right and its version of populism. We have also seen the attempt from systemic forces to present Emmanuel Macron, a politician who is very close to being the product of the economic and political system, as an alternative. And in Britain, we should also not forget that part of the dynamic of a Brexit was a feeling of working class despair. And it's very telling that today the 25th, the European Union celebrated its 60th birthday at a moment that it is facing an intense and almost existential crisis, exemplified in the fact that the declaration of this anniversary begins with the phrase, "We, the 27 states," whereas nominally they are still 28. Now, was this defeat in Greece something unavoidable? Was the problem the strength of the people? And what can we learn from this experience? What I would like, it is in this context with which I'd like to enter the main topic of my debate, which is the question of how do we create a people? By this I mean that the formation of the people as collective subject of emancipation, as the unity of struggle of the subaltern classes, as the collective process of making possible an alternative future, is not something spontaneous or autopoietic, but the contingent result of political interventions and projects. It is interesting that the very notion of the people has returned in the public debate. It has been the collective identity in many instances of the new movements. We saw it in Greece, in Spain, in Occupy, in Turkey during the Gezi Park protests. We have also seen it being recuperated by the right in various forms or discursive tropes, in many cases associated with the notion of the nation, from far-right populism in Europe to the rhetoric of Donald Trump. Now, one way that has been suggested to deal with this return of this question is by a theory of populism. There is an important current in contemporary radical theory that has used populism not as a pejorative term, but as an analytical concept associated with the work of Ernesto Laclau. Laclau's theory has been used in order to analyze what has happened in Greece. It has been important in the theoretical formation of Podemos, with many of the leading cadres of Podemos, who also tend to be radical scholars, having constructed their particular discourses upon openly Laclausian thematics, exemplified in the opposition between the people and the casta. However, I don't think that this approach can help us. I think that the very idea of the centrality of discourse in Laclau tends to dissociate politics from antagonistic social relations of oppression and exploitation. It is true that Laclau himself had gone at lengths to suggest that his idiosyncratic conception of discourse is not limited to the symbolic, but refers to the way social practices are articulated and to the fact that societies are always open to processes of resignification, rearticulation, and reform. However, I still think that there is a problem here. His position that politics is about the contested terrain of free-floating signifiers such as people, democracy, freedom, equality, I think that turns the observation into explanation. It is true that the politics of the bourgeois epoch, the politics of modernity, are also about contrasting discursive conceptions of such signifiers, but this has to do exactly with the evolution of class struggles, the particular demands of the working classes to be recognized as part of the collective body politic, and the emergence of modern democratic forms, the fact that subalternity is interiorized in the collective body of the nation or the people nation. And I think that one can turn to the recent work of both Etienne Balibar to retrace his history, or go to the work of Rancière, and his conception of democratic politics as the politics of the demands of those who are not counted in a certain political and social configuration, to see the class-related potential of the notion of the people. So the people does not refer to a floating signifier, but to a moment in the history of class struggles. And in this sense, I think that scholars such as Jacobin are right to try to reinscribe the notion of the people in the context of a Marxist class analytic perspective. However, I would like to suggest that we must see between two moments of the people. One is the people as it emerges from the struggle, the moment of the mass rally, the reclaiming of public space. Let's call it the moment of the crowd, or the riot, if you prefer something more dynamic. The other, however, is the people as the process of collective transformation. In contemporary radical theory, there are examples of a celebration of the crowd and the mass riot, from the conceptualization of multitude in the work of Negri and Hart, to the invocation of the mass riot recently by Alain Badiou, and the resurgence of anarchist readings of recent movements. What is particular about in these approaches is a certain emphasis on horizontality, or to put it in different terms, an emphasis on basically people coming together in non-hierarchical structures, creating forms of social cooperation, but without the organizational forms that we associate with politics. I think that this is an indispensable aspect of radical politics, but we need to approach it in a more critical way. We need politics from below, but we need politics. Recently, there has been a really interesting philosophical polemic against horizontality. I am referring to the last book by Frédéric Lordon, entitled Imperium. Lordon reminds us of an important point by Spinoza in the Political Treatise, where in a fascinating and dialectical way, the latter links the imperium, which we can translate as sovereignty or state, but sovereignty I think it's closer, with potentia multitudinits, the potential or the power of the multitude. Now, this should not be read only in a positive or optimist way, as it is the case in the celebration of the potential of the multitude in Hart's and Negri's empire, but also in a negative way. It is exactly the negative potential that can explain how people enable oppressive or exploitative situations. So in this sense, potentia multitudinits can mean either communism, it can also mean fascism in the Spinozist reading. So, but what is interesting in Lordon's approach is that the politics of emancipation cannot be simply based upon the spontaneous coming together of people. It must be translated into a political project, forms of organization, and forms of sovereignty. In Spinozist terms, emancipation and equality must also take the form of an imperium, albeit one determined by the positive, the joyous passions of the multitude, the collective determination and creativity of a people in struggle, and this cannot be simply horizontal. Now, having said that, the usual move at this point would be to jump to the question of organization as the step that marks the passage from the moment of the crowd to the moment of the party, that is, when social dynamics are transformed into autonomous political subjects. But I would like not to take this jump right now. I think that we need a different path. So I would like to make a small detour to Antonio Gramsci and his notion of the historical block and how it can help us rethink some of the questions we face. As with many other notions in the vocabulary of Gramsci, it is an experimental notion, part of a work in progress. And I think the following quotation sort of summarizes the dynamic of these notions. That's probably one of the two quotations I will use in this presentation. So Gramsci says, if the relationship between intellectuals and people nation, between the leaders and the led, the rulers and the ruled, is provided by an organic cohesion in which feeling passion becomes understanding and hence knowledge, not mechanically, but in a way that it is active, then and only then is the relationship one of representation. Only then can there take place an exchange of individual elements between the rulers and ruled, the leaders and the led, and can the shared life be realized, which alone is a social force with the creation of the historical block. What I take in this reading, which I can analyze this text in a much more philological way because it's very rich in Gramscian notions, is that it is a strategic, not a descriptive or an analytical concept. It does not describe social alliance, which is the usual way to translate historical bloc, an alliance around the working class. No, it means the condition where hegemony has been achieved. An articulation between social forces, alternative economic forms in rupture with capitalist social relations, new forms of political organization, and new participatory democratic decision-making processes. Now, the extent to which we see the actual emergence of an historical bloc is a way to see the different degrees of effectivity of different experiments in radical left politics. In such a perspective, for example, the endurance and radicalism, despite their obvious contradictions, of the experiments in Venezuela and Bolivia reflect the tentative and uneven emergence of a potential historical bloc, whereas the defeat of Syriza would point exactly to the absence of an emerging historical bloc, despite the tectonic shifts in Greek society. And I would also like to suggest that although usually Gramsci self-defined himself as an absolute historicist, this should not be read in an idealist or metaphysical position. In fact, Gramsci is based upon a materialist ontology of singularities. Broad historical tendencies do not represent historical laws, as traditional Marxists might have said, but the complex interplay of singular interactions, practices, and strategies. The emergence of bourgeois hegemony was the outcome of a complex and uneven combination of economic forms, political struggles, discursive tropes, public and private hegemonic apparatuses, from state education to newspapers and football clubs. And I would like to suggest that in this sense, the ontological base for a new historical bloc is rather close to the position suggested by Deleuze or Guattari, or the later work of Louis Althusser that centers upon the notion of the encounter. And I think that this background can also be read in Spinoza's terms as the emphasis on individuals or singular things being themselves not eternal essences, but rather encounters and assemblages of singularities, the encounter itself being dependent upon the conditions that make or unmake it. Hegemony, in this sense, is exactly the set of political practices and hegemonic apparatuses that actually make such encounters last. And I think that we can find a very useful guideline in the Deleuzian notion of the art of organizing good encounters, which for me presents a way of thinking politics of equality, of emancipation. A successful political meeting, an appeal for mass mobilization that ends up in massive presence, a confluence of struggles, a sizer of the moment, the formation of a new political party, all these can be considered examples of good encounters, or to use Machiavelli's terms, combinations of fortuna and virtu. The question is how this is organized, prepared, even though not predetermined, and also, as Althusser might have put it, how can this encounter last? How the dynamic, for example, of the referendum in Greece, the Ochi vote, could last and not be a passing moment. So in this sense, we can say that the emergence of a new historical bloc is exactly the outcome of a series of good and lasting encounters. And I would like to give also another example, for example, that the many forms of solidarity that we continue to see in Greece between, Greeks and migrants is not just an expression of an excess of sensitivity. They're also good encounters, ways to recreate new forms of being together. Now, having made this small philosophical detour, which I would like to suggest that all these politics, things that we faced in Greece, can be thought of as an attempt towards recuperating popular sovereignty. In the European context, of course, this brings forward the centrality of the rupture with the embedded neoliberalism of the European Union and the Eurozone, but I think it has a broader significance. And following Peter Hallward, I can say that sovereignty in this sense is the moment of the will of the people, defined as deliberate, emancipatory, and inclusive process of collective self-determination. Now, this reclaiming of popular sovereignty is not simply about a defense of democratic choice and democratic process. I think it acquires a content only when it represents an alternative narrative for society. Now, but to deal with this, we must go beyond a certain Byzantine conception of the political program in the sense of an artificial construction of another society. But at the same time, we must avoid of thinking of political program as simply a sum of grievances or a sum of anti-austerity demands. I think that what we need is something that points to the direction of concentrating efforts at the nodal points of social production and reproduction in order to actually change the relations of forces. For example, in Greece, no program of equality or emancipation cannot avoid, for example, the question of the rupture with the European Union. I mean, you cannot talk about, in Greece, about abolishing capitalism or at the same time remain silent about the euro and the eurozone, but at the same time you cannot break from the eurozone, which basically it was the big white whale for Greek bourgeoisie since the early 1960s, without expecting to have just a better capitalism. I mean, the very process of rupture, from the practical exigencies to the strategic necessities, requires to think in an anti-capitalist way. But at the same time, I think that this narrative or the program, the content of a newly defined sovereignty cannot be thought of simply as a construction, but also as a liberation of social experimentation. So it's exactly why things like public ownership, workers' control, and self-management can be crucial aspects of such a process, exactly because they involve new forms of participation, control from below, openness to the broader society, and exactly the kind of experimentation that we need. And I will come back to that later. Now, but sovereignty is also about political power, and what happened in Greece was a power confrontation, the power of the Greek government versus the European Union, and whether it could stand up to the challenge, etc., etc. I would suggest that any newly defined form of popular sovereignty would require something that would be described as a permanent dual power. I'm not using here dual power in the very strict sense of a relatively short period between, an insurrectionary armed people and the instruments of the state, which usually should end with the victory of one pole or the other, but as a more permanent condition of a process of social change that where forms of power from above, even forms of radical, let's say, left-wing governance, whatever this could mean, must coincide with autonomous movements from below, but also autonomous forms of exercising popular power. And I think this is the only way that we can think of the question of a progressive or a left-wing government. I mean, because the actual existing state apparatuses, and we can use Poulanger's to this direction as a theoretical reference, they represent a condensation of a balance of forces, but they present a condensation of a balance of forces in favor of the ruling class. They represent an excess of power over the popular movement. So you need to find a way to counter this excess, and simply having your people as ministers in a government is not enough. You need the extra force of a strong movement. But this requires a new practice of politics. And back in the 1970s, Etienne Balibar described it as the emergence of new forms of mass political organization exterior to the state, and as the penetration of politics within the realm of production, putting an end to the bourgeois separation of economics and politics. So I would also suggest that this should also be thought of as a process of experimentation, because this is creating alternatives. It's not just about imposing, let's say, a better macroeconomic condition and some nationalizations, because basically it would have been like going back to 1960s social democracy. We think we need a more radical transformation, but this requires the emergence of new forms, new ways of doing things in the economy, in circulation, everywhere. So you need experimentation. You need what we can call as the collective ingenuity of the people in struggle. And it's interesting that the notion of the ingenium also exists in Spinoza. Usually it refers to the particular laws or customs arising out of a singular history of a nation. But I think it can also be read as an ability of society to create its own ingenium, new ingenia, new ways of doing things. Now, but this does not mean that this is just an artificial creation. It's important to see how you can learn from things already happening in society. Back in the 1970s, Louis Althusser had a leitmotif in many of his interventions in the last part of the 70s, which was the traces of communism, a phrase which we find in many of his works, or the virtual forms of communism existing in the interstices of capitalist social forms. Now, I think it's interesting to how can you have a politics which can read and at the same time enhance these traces of communism or traces of equality or emancipation, whatever you want to call them, in experiments of self-management, in the defense of public goods and public spaces, in new forms of participatory democracy, in movements, in the important traditions of equal voicing that have been tested in movements, or in the very simple, yet so important gestures of solidarity that we have seen. But this, in order to do this, requires a certain attitude. It means, and I quote here from Althusser, this is the second and last quotation, it means restoring their voice to the masses who make history, learning how to be attentive to the masses' imagination and inventiveness. Now, and I think that one of the most impressive elements we saw in the struggles in Greece was the extent to which people actually debated and discussed within movements, put themselves in the position to try to think of alternatives and discuss how can a school be organized, what kind of health system we want, how can we have a different agricultural orientation. And one of the biggest deficiencies of the Greek left was the fact that it did not learn from these discussions. It did not encourage the debate. It did not got involved with it. Because basically the problem is simple. I don't think that defeat can be explained in general by the existence of traitors or people that were not, morally up to the standard, things like that. I think the problem is that if you reach at a point where you feel as a collective subject that you do not have enough answers and enough intellectual means to deal with the difficulties of a process of rupture, then you cannot stand up to the pressure. If you don't have the answers, you feel weak and you cannot confront the systemic violence you oppose. Now, but if we talk about the content of popular sovereignty, but what about the people? I think that before moving on, there is a need to tackle two sets of contradictions inside the people, to borrow that old phrase from Chairman Mao. One has to do with a contemporary potential form of unity of labor, and one that has to do with the question of a post-national and post-colonial conception of the people. Now, regarding the unity of labor, I think is that it is interesting that we need to think how can we have a common condition of labor despite the very, very different conditions of actual labor practices today, both in material conditions but also in terms of geographical dispersion. We have seen the political potential of their coming together in the big moments of the movements in the past years. And as I already said, I don't believe that this was because of a certain discursive interpellation, that people came together under a certain common signifier. There was a material coming together. And I think that Poulantzas says someplace that people is a concept of strategy which points to the direction of an actual social alliances as a result of the evolution of contemporary forms of capital accumulation that create material conditions that bring together working class strata, new petty bourgeois strata in the Poulantzan sense, state employees, even segments of the traditional petty bourgeois strata as a result of the inability of the contemporary neoliberal policies to actually form their own historical bloc, including these strata. This creates common demands and interests based upon the common condition of labor, precariousness, unemployment, exploitation, increased difficulty in dealing with basic needs. It is a condition that in a certain manner can unite the undocumented migrant with the young degree holder that moves from unemployment into precarious part-time work and back into unemployment. I mean, in a country like Greece, workers' rights are in a certain way inexistent whenever you are a natural citizen or you are an undocumented migrant. You can get the same kind of employers abuse that in both ways. So, moreover, I think that it's not just a question of common grievances. I think that also all these social strata share the same contradiction that runs through contemporary capitalism. The fact that the contemporary labor force is at the same time more precarious, more insecure, more subject to forms of systemic violence, more fragmented, but also more in possession of these intellectual and communicative skills to realize its role as producer of social wealth and also in a possibility to articulate demands. And I would suggest that a comparison between the resistance and organization strategies of modern grassroots labor movements, especially in precarious workers, and certain aspects of the ingenuity of collective resistances by refugees and undocumented migrants can be really illuminating in very common elements. Now, so I think that there is a material base in this sense to create a common identity of people that basically have to sell their labor power and be exploited in order to make a living, although they are actually creators of society and social wealth. The other contradiction has to do with the question of ethnicity. I mean, we know the problem, historically the notion of the people and the notion of the nation were articulated as part of the same historical process, but today such an attempt to think the people as the people of the nation can only lead to reactionary nationalism, which is not only the privilege of the far right, it is also emerging, especially in Europe, as part of the political mainstream. For example, the European Union criticizes Great Britain because it's supposedly going to close up its borders to European Union citizens trying to move there. At the same time, European Union is basically building walls against migrants and refugees and denying the right of free passage to asylum seekers. And we also seen that the current rise of Islamophobia in many European countries is not against migrants, it is against citizens. It's against a very important segment of the French or the German working class. For example, and we can say that the far right is demonized in mainstream press, but its agenda is hegemonic in the political mainstream. Now, so in this sense, I think that, and it's also very important to know that you can see they can never be like us attitude going far beyond the far right. You can see it in the political mainstream, in social democracy, even in mainstream. For example, in France, you can even see it in mainstream feminism in certain particular French debates of the past 10 or 15 years. So I think that exactly against that, we need a post-national, a post-colonial version of the people, or if we want to play with words, a post-national, post-colonial notion of the nation. In the sense that we need a redefinition based upon the common condition of subalternity that links it for ethnicity, origin, or common history, and links it to common condition present as struggle. It is also, in my reading, a secessionist conception of the people because it includes an oppositional approach to the enemies of the people, many of them nominally members of the nation. Because it's obvious that we can no longer think of an imaginary community of common history or common values, but of an actual unity in struggle of the subaltern classes, the unity of those who share the same problems, misery, hope. And of course, it also requires a certain confrontation with the consequences of colonialism and a confrontation that goes much beyond reconciliation. It requires actual acknowledgement of its fact. It also requires a recognition that the resistances, histories, traditions of migrants and refugees can also be necessary for the collective elaboration of a political project for a new historical bloc. And in this sense, such construction of the people is by itself the terrain of social and political antagonism. And I would say, following Deleuze, that we are talking indeed about a people that is missing, a people that is to be produced, a people to come, not the myth of a past people, but the storytelling of a people to come. And it is in this sense that anti-racism acquires a broader significance. And to give an example from Greece, practices such as self-managed occupied spaces for refugees are not simple autonomous solidarity. They are the places where a new conception of a common life in transformation emerges. It's beyond solidarity towards the notion of we live together, we struggle together, which is exactly for me a very important process of creating such a people. Now, and I think that, I'm always very interested in reading the relevant debates in Canada, which of course is not about migrants. It is about how you deal with indigenous nations and their right and their own claims in sovereignty. But I think that whatever, we heard a fantastic speech by Glenn Coulthard, the opening of the conference, and I think basically all these debates point to the direction that a possibility of an emancipative, transformative, egalitarian form of sovereignty in a post-national context goes hand in hand with moving beyond the imperatives of capitalist accumulation. Finally, but what are the spaces to create these people? And this is the question of organization, so I did not make a jump. I arrived rather late to that question. I think, of course, that this requires moving beyond a traditional division of labor between movement activism and politics, in the sense that movements are not simply instruments to change the balance of forces or instruments to implement a political line. Movements by themselves are places of elaboration and spaces of dialogue. But I also think that we need to rethink political organization, because basically what was missing in the Greek context was the left, or whatever the left as a free-floating signifier could mean, that could actually bring this to the end. Now, I believe that what we need to think is the centrality of the notion of the front. Now, in the Marxist and communist and socialist or communist tradition, the United Front usually has been seen in rather instrumental ways. Although, from the beginning, it marked an important realization that there's no metaphysical connection, one class, one party, because it's the realization there are more than one parties reclaiming the same class references. But I think that we need to go a little beyond that. What we need, and I also say that if I would play with words, I would say that we do not need a working class party. We need an organization or a party for equality or emancipation, or if you prefer, an organization or party for communism, but which in itself has to be deeply, organically rooted into the practices, resistances, solidarities, and collective ingenuity and inventiveness of the working classes in order to be in a position to be an organization for equality. So, but this today requires bringing together many, many different forms of commitments, sensitivities, and practices into a common democratic process, which at the same time respects and transforms initial practices and sensitivities, always keeping in mind that this process is by itself a terrain of struggle. And I think that this is a debate which with very different starting points is open, both in the rather difficult and painful process of recomposing the left in the European context. Basically, most of the European left is in shambles, so that's the only way to describe it. But I also see with very interest in North America, especially in the States, the current debates. I mean, all these things written in Jacobin or Viewpoint or other. I think that's why I think that we must think in a more dialectical way exactly the front as a point of convergence. But I would like to think it also as a constituent process, not as a negotiation between different tendencies. And to give an example, this is the difference between parties such as MAS in Bolivia or PSUV in Venezuela that maintained and close organic and historical relations to social movements, and the experience of Greece. I mean, Syriza was never the outcome of a constituent process of movements, sensitivities, theories, etc., etc. It was a left-wing party. It was active in the movement. This is undeniable. It just filled, let's say, a political vacuum at a moment of acute crisis and got a big electoral following. But it was not the outcome of the process, that organic relationship with the social dynamic that would have also make it actually the leading force to a victorious confrontation. I think that Gramsci's notion of the party as a laborator, or I prefer to use the phrase as laboratory for new mass political intellectualities, I think it's very important because it suggests spaces where people from the movement come not only to be politicized, something that unfortunately in the tradition of the left often meant a top-down version of ideological indoctrination, but to contribute with their own voice and experience process in the complex in the process of elaboration of alternatives. And I think it is in this sense that the metaphor of the laboratory is better than other metaphors, especially those coming from the military terrain, for example, the old notion of the party as the general quarters of an army, etc., etc. And it's also here in the articulation of movements, demands, strategies, learning processes, and theories inside a democratic political front of the radical left that we can see a way out of the simple invocation of horizontality or simple intersectionality without at the same time falling into the trap of imposing an imaginary unity or a quasi-metaphysical conception of the right political line. And of course, democracy and democratic procedure also has another important aspect that we need to, if we want to persuade people on the feasibility of social transformation, we must be able to prove that political organizations can be more democratic, egalitarian, and creative and anti-sexist than everyday life. Because if things are worse inside the organization regarding this aspect, something that we have seen in certain tragic cases of the left globally, then how can you persuade that it can make a better society? Anyway, now, and of course, we also need to prove that political organizations are in a position to change. I think that the efficacy of a political organization is the degree that it changes after important cathartic moments of struggle in order not to become an anachronism. This is a phrase from Gramsci. He says that there is the danger that a political party becomes an anachronism. So basically, this is something to think of. Now, to conclude, I mean, perhaps there are many reasons of despair in the current context, especially in the particular Greek context, and we are still going through a process of recomposition and rethinking after an important defeat. But I still think that we have the possibility to put our collective political and intellectual capacities to good use and indeed help the collective creation of the people to come, provided that we learn from the previous sequences and change, provided that we remember that if we cannot change ourselves, we cannot possibly change society, and provided that we actually engage in the road of self-criticism, reflection, and actual learning for our experience. And I think if we do that, hope is possible. Hope is never something to believe in. Hope is always something to work and struggle for. Thank you.
So I want to thank Panagiotis for that theoretically rich and detailed talk. And we have some time, so I would welcome questions, comments, I think, on any aspect of what Panagiotis had to say. Greece certainly has been at the forefront of struggles of all sorts of kinds for the past decade, so there's much to talk about. Len?
This was more than a good encounter. This was a wonderful encounter, and I thank you sincerely for it. And also I thank you for reminding us about the political agency of the Agora, that those who refuse debate will be impoverished by that refusal. Brief anecdote, after a day in Syntagma Square reading the ancient epigraphy and the modern graffiti 3 years ago in Athens, going back to my hotel with my partner, and the big boys had arrived from Brussels in order to dispense tough love on Greece as the failed state or a defector in the Eurozone. There was a soccer game going on. It happened to be between Greece and Germany, and everybody was cheering for Greece. So there is a kind of avenue into popular solidarity that often we neglect. I have two questions. One is about the rehabilitation of the sense of common grievances. Prior to the French Revolution, the cahier de doléances, the list of grievances, was a major instrument in the mobilization. Now we have Donald Trump and the lumpen Republican sense of grievance. Can we, as a left movement, rehabilitate the sense of grievance in a politically productive way? That would be one question I have. The other question I have is about solidarity. How do we speak it? How do we mobilize in the interests of it? I thought Althusser and Gramsci very compellingly, but what is the mechanism of translatability from those insights, from those citations, into a political project, not only in Canada, but more broadly today?
Thanks, man.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, yes, I do agree that I spoke not really negative about common grievances, and of course in the history of the French Revolution, Le Cahier de Doléances was a really important moment. What I was trying to say is that radical politics must move beyond that point. But it is a necessary starting point, and the very articulation of a demand, the very articulation that there is a problem somewhere in contrast to the neoliberal consensus is obviously indispensable. But what I had in mind was a very particular European kind of debate in the left, where for many years anti-austerity was considered to be a political alternative. Anti-austerity is an expression of the problem. And in the European Union, for example, you could say, I am against the austerity of the European Union. Okay, so how can you get out of it, for example, if you do not are ready to enter a process of rupture with the European Union or the Eurozone? That was basically the context of my but I also think that it can also be generalized that, there is the demand for redistribution is obviously a very important starting point, but there is a moment when you can have the neoliberals. I'm not talking about the lumpen neoliberals, some more thinking that might say, okay, listen, you're right, we should have more redistribution, but listen, that is how the system works, and basically this is the only way to have investment and have some kind of growth and have some trickle-down results, etc., etc. It is at that point, for example, of a debate, if you reach that point, that you need to have an alternative that goes beyond simple redistribution of wealth. That is my point. I understand that it's not always generalizable, and there are different conjectures, but this was my point about grievances. Now, regarding solidarity, I think, solidarity is very important in many cases, basically because, especially in the Greek context, you had a people who was in despair. You had people that were in grievance, that were poor, that were, and this was the important thing that we saw. We saw in acts of solidarity, sort of people creating, at least for other people, a better condition, the condition that perhaps they would also like to have for themselves. This was like a prefiguration of an alternative. That is the important in all these gestures of solidarity that we saw in Greece. It was not philanthropy. It was not the kind of solidarity you get from people that are in a safer position towards those that are. It was people that were also equally precarious or perilous lives. We were also expressing solidarity. This was the important thing, and the deeper morality of the action and the political significance, and can explain, especially Greece, why so many people went and worked to this direction. At the same time, solidarity, I think, but I also think that this goes also to other countries. I mean, the fact that people that were also waging very important struggles in their own countries also thought it necessarily to think of solidarity about another country. This is also something that has the same importance in my eyes. So I think this is something to work. Although I always think that the best way to express solidarity is by waging struggle in your own country, giving examples or preparing raptures. I think this is the internationalism of today that we need. I mean, it was always like that. I mean, internationalism was always about, going out to join the Civil War and the brigades, but it was also about, waging class struggle in your own country. So basically, I think we need both, and we still need. So this is now. How do we translate all these references? Well, this is the open question. But I'm not saying it only in retrospective. I had the feeling, and many people had the same feeling in the period, especially before, until 2013, 2014, before the electoral eventuality of 2015. You had the feeling that what had happened in Greece was a cathartic moment. It was a moment where people had faced an extreme deterioration of social conditions. They were much more open than any other time in the past 20 or 30 years to listen to alternatives. They were in a position in their own personal lives, their own personal despair. They were seeing the earth move under their feet. They were themselves doing things that they would not imagine. For example, the very big and important movements of civil disobedience regarding paying electricity bills and things like that. The very fact that ordinary people would go for a month every afternoon at a square, I'm not talking about Syntagma, I'm talking about small cities in other places, although they would try to seek a political organization, despite the chaotic forms that this might have taken, because they were left, patriotic, national, and all kinds of hybrids that grew out of this. But at that moment, you had the feeling that if there was a political left that could actually enter into this kind of dialogue, transformation, transform the dynamics, mix it in a positive way with some basic, let's say Marxist or whatever you can say them, orientation, and insist on a strategy of rupture and think the originality of the conjuncture. I come from a tradition which I never believed in left-wing government. To give a personal reference, I grew up thinking, well, Allende was a hero, but the problem was that he thought that he could do it in the parliamentary way. So if I speak now about the possibility of this kind of, I speak it because you had the feeling in Greece that you could have a change in governance plus the extra force of a movement and I think this is also an open question. So this is my answer to the question of how can we translate all these things.
I have a few questions here. I'll take this one first. Pass the microphone.
Thank you. I'll do my best to ask the coherent question. It's actually a sort of a comparative question, and you alluded a couple of times to cases in Latin America. And I've been rather puzzled, and I wonder whether you could speak to this, at what I see as the very different response when similar processes impinge on peoples in Latin America and people peoples in Europe, including but not limited to Southern Europe. And let me give a bit of an example. I was following the case of Greece and the catastrophic collapse and disappointment, to say the least, with Syriza's response to the demands of the Troika. And I'm from Argentina, so you probably know, very aware of, about 15 years before, we had a similar process. What we had was a government that came to power on not a very clear mandate, left mandate. It was simply a mandate of at least not going in the direction of the neoliberal capitalist financial institutions, rejecting that. But then, and similarly, I would argue with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, because he didn't come out and say, I'm a socialist. He came out as a socialist only after the coup was defeated, right? And he came back to power. So in cases in Latin America, you have people who come with sort of an unclear mandate, but then end up being more or less, complex, right? But sort of representative of the popular will. However, in contrast, for instance, in Greece, they were called, they call themselves, radical left. And not only, I think they were sort of anything but I mean, if they were any sort of left, they were sort of the left hand of capitalism. And how did that happen? What explains that sort of differential response that we do not have this sort of, dysfunctional left to some degree, right? Everything is qualified. We have the right-wing regimes, and if we're lucky enough, we get rid of them and we have something better. But when you have a left in Europe or North America, it doesn't look like a left to me. So I wonder whether you could speak to that.
Well, the contradiction that you mentioned is real. I mean, the people, for example, in Syriza, the current leading group, people like Tsipras himself, I mean, if you talk to them, because I know enough of them, well, they're very well versed in Marxism. They could probably, go through graduate level Marxist seminars really easily. Some of them are important intellectuals. I mean, but at the same time, the problem is exactly that you had an entire process of transformation of the communist left in Western Europe, including Greece, whereas all these kind of references went hand in hand with a reformist trend, and especially in the European context, Europeanism. Europeanism is a mental block in a certain way. It is like medieval maps. Medieval maps had Finis Moody, had the end of the world, and afterwards there were monsters. So basically, for many people in the left, the euro was like a medieval map. There's nothing after it. So this created, and also what I say is that many parties of the European left were basically accustomed, really comfortable, of being a rather radical in discourse minority, active in movements, anti-global movements gave a new impetus to them, rhetorically radical, academically radical, producing good PhDs or articles, etc., but not saying, okay, power, who's going to ask us about power? We have a long way to go until power, and then they become, accidental heroes in a certain way because they feel a political vacuum. When Syriza became an important party because it said, vote us, we can have a left-wing government, which basically gave a reason to people to say, because until then the left said in the run-up to the 2012 election, it said, vote us, we will be a better opposition. And then Syriza said, out of opportunism, there was nothing. It was electoral opportunism. It was a catchphrase, vote us, we can be government. And they came second, and so they became the government in waiting. That's a way to deal with the process. Of course, we missed in Greece the kind of interaction between political formations and movements that we can see in both I think in Venezuela and Bolivia. Argentina is different. It's a different. Argentina is an example that even Syriza could do better than that. I mean, even a reformist party could not just capitulate at the first 6 months of election. If progressive Peronists can do it, why not? But I think we missed something like the process from which mass emerged in Bolivia out of grassroots struggles and a certain dialogue. And this goes for the entire left. Okay, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone. It goes also for the anti-capitalist left from which I came. I mean, it was. I still try to think and reflect upon that. Why we did not learn more, experiment more, create, not just get people more, but create a party or an organization or a front that would reflect that dynamic and actually be, the backbone of a potential historical bloc.
There were a couple more questions. One here, and then Nick. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for that. It was a really great talk. I have 2 questions for you. Here in Canada, we see the rise of the alt-right, but we have an additional issue of trying to be able to connect our collective grievances, which you mentioned briefly but didn't really elaborate on, is just the issue of colonialism. And so we have a rising right both all along North America, but at the same time we have, I think, trouble within the left, or the so-called left, like within North America, to be able to unite our struggles in a common front, specifically because everyone is very focused on very particular issues that they're waging, either environmental or indigenous or issues of poverty and other things that are very difficult to grasp, like even within an anti-capitalist framework. And so how do we connect, according to this particular issue, how do we connect our different grievances to something more cohesive, especially in dealing with issues of identity politics, and especially in that white settlers are constantly being put into the category of white settlers versus indigenous people, or different categories. And so that's one thing that, at least in North America, we see. I wanted to see what your thoughts are on that. And the second question that I have is in regards to the issue of the question of the organization of parties and tendencies of the sort. So, like, we've seen it. You mentioned in Greece the fact that that Syriza didn't really reflect the ongoing popular movement that was actually going on, and it wasn't really cohesive. It also happened. Also in Chile, you would also say that the which is where I'm from, although I don't identify as being Chilean, I identify as being Mapuche, indigenous from that area. But we've seen how the left has basically been co-opted by the right, and how it's been basically a tool for neoliberal agendas. And so, and even in other parts of it, I know you mentioned that Bolivia and Venezuela are kind of beacons of hope in that way, but they're also actively organizing, for example, especially in the terms of Bolivia and Venezuela, but Venezuela specifically, have issues with dealing with their indigenous population, and actually have acted against many of the autonomous indigenous uprisings of their own people. And so how can we assure that these different organizations or these different parties don't actually get institutionalized by the state that they're part of, essentially? And what is your notion exactly of what that kind of organization looks like? And not necessarily, does it have to be a party structure? Can it be a movement? And how does that relate to the state? So that's all I wanted to ask.
That's one question.
Okay, well, I think that the question of, first of all, any radical left-wing politics today must acknowledge the relative autonomy of all these struggles, must acknowledge their particular dynamic, and must acknowledge that might be even contradictions. This is necessary. It has to accept it. And especially regarding the colonial aspects, in this sense, let's say that those that represent the dominant populations must accept the right of a reclaiming of identity in a positive way, and memory and history from those that have been oppressed. And this is necessary even for the subaltern classes of, let's say, the dominant populations. It is important. It is a cathartic moment. And if the left does not do it, this can be catastrophic. To give an example, the French Communist Party had a very, very contradictory position versus Algeria. It dismantled the Algerian organization in the 1930s, and it took it a little more time than necessary to denounce colonialism and embrace, for example, the struggle of the FLN in Algeria. And I mean, there were even Marxists, French Marxists, that opted to be members of the Algerian Communist, of the FLN instead of the Communist Party. Georges Labicar was such an example, a very important Althusserian sort of philosopher. So, and this led, we still find this problem, this non-acceptance of the importance of dealing with the colonial past in contemporary debates in France, is the inability of the radical left to mount against the systemic Islamophobia, which is very, very particular in France. It's unlike other countries. It's systemic, and really pervasive. So I think this sort of gives an answer to this question. This is a difficult process. It is the responsibility. This is one of the things where the left can actually be a vanguard. It can actually be an educator. It is of the parts where, indeed, you have this responsibility to speak about this subject instead of saying, okay, I would not like to confront. You need to confront, you need to educate, and this creates conditions. Now, regarding how do you bring together all these different things, the basic thing is to find ways to see how all these grievances, all these movements can have a common, let's say, post-capitalist, anti-capitalist perspective. This is not something that's just a catchphrase. Okay, this requires in its country which are the specific demands around which we can articulate. I'm more familiar with the European context. For example, I can say that a rupture with the European integration process is a nodal point around which you can articulate both particular struggles and anti-capitalist formations. For example, I don't know, I'm not really familiar with the Canadian, for example, but I would say that if Canada still is not like the US in the sense that it still has some sort of public provision, social welfare state or something like that, the defense of this can be a meeting point of different things. And regarding organization, what I think is important is the democratic front. Until now we have the front mainly as negotiation between tendencies, especially in the name of let's get unanimous sort of decisions, etc., etc. I believe in democratic fronts, majorities, minorities, convergence between breaking down the barriers between different tendencies, very open in debate, but also a front, something that is political, something to which you participate, you are a member. So this is a very general idea.
Thanks, Panagiotis. I think we have time for one or two more. I think Nick has a mic, and there's someone at the back who had a hand up. Is it? Yes, okay, great. Then Nick, and then you, sir, and then I think that'll be the end. Nick?
Thank you, Panagiotis. That was a talk of exceptional scope and intensity. I want to ask you to clarify your thinking about the categories of front and party, because, as you just explained, front suggests a process of linkage of movements that somehow construct affinities, whereas party historically indicates a much more centralized agency for the passage from one mode of production to another. But you seem to actually, I'll say it in the last part of your talk, you played a bit fast and loose between those two categories. You were switching back and forth between the party and the front with quite a lot of rapidity. So what's going on here? Is it the party that is organizing the front, or is it the front that is becoming the party?
Okay, yes, yes, you're... Okay, well, I think that I don't believe that we can, at least in the context of most Western European countries or North America, you can say that you actually have examples of the party. And I don't believe that the party conceived as a centralized organization which in a certain metaphysical way expresses a social class. So it's something that we can still cling up onto. I think that what we need, I insist on the importance of the political formation of something, of having a way where of convergence, which can be also a place to elaborate strategy. This would be my own idiosyncratic Leninism, if you prefer, but I would say that in a current period, a period of recomposition, the front is the party. What we need is a front, multiple tendencies, multiple organizations, convergence of movements and individuals in an attempt to have not an artificial centralism, but an actual democratic process of convergence and articulation of a common strategy. Of course, this does not by itself offer an answer to all the problems that bureaucracies can also emerge. Hierarchies can also, rigid hierarchies can also emerge. The only way I can think to deal with them is by making, let's say, self-criticism a political and philosophical strategy. I mean, that's the only way, constant processes of re-evaluation, but there's no guarantees in this direction, and perhaps the more open a political front, a political formation, a political process is to movements, to militants, to activists, and the more guarantees it has against permanent hierarchies and permanent party bureaucracies, this at least can help this more dynamic process, but there's no guarantee on that. This is, in a certain way, always the difficulty, the tragic difficulty of emancipatory politics. Emancipatory politics is a subaltern aspect of politics. So it's always more difficult for it to emerge, but it is possible.
And one last question.
Sure, thanks. And this probably follows along the same lines as Nick's question. I really appreciated the timing of your presentation. That is, you made us wait for the organization to arrive near the end. That was great. So I want to ask you about the temporality of the party, like when it arrives as well. You mentioned when it came to Syriza, like they showed up to fill a political vacuum. That phrase, right, is a metaphor of a lack of some sort, right? So I wonder when a lack is perceived and who perceives it. I'm thinking of a flipped version of the relationship between movements and parties, which is movements are composing themselves, and I really like the philosophical investigations help me think about the relation between composition and organization, which is the Spinoza and Deleuzian line. That's a separate thing. So the composition of the movements are happening. In Occupy, for instance, there was a recognition that excitement and the catharsis and all of this that's happening is like blood to a vampire, right? The parties show up, they see excitement, they see enthusiasm, they see the action, and they want to organize it, right? So that's different from saying, there's a vacuum. It says there's actually an abundance of things going on, and there's a siphon that shows up in the claim of organizing, right? So I want to ask. I also want to say front is very fascinating too. Front, because the other parts of things like Occupy were the front lines of defense. So when you defend the experiments, or the experiments need defending, and it's a question of whether parties ever show up to actually defend the experiments versus turning them into something else. But so I want to ask specifically about Syriza, where was there something in the movements themselves that perceived a kind of need for the next stage, right? And what specifically was missing? Was it again, fighting off the state, the desire to transform the government? Where was that desire sort of emerging from the movements that then Syriza could fill?
Well, first of all, you're right. The phrase that if Syriza had covered the political vacuum, this would have been a good thing. I mean, the problem is that in a way the space remained open, and what I meant was that Syriza was a party that already existed. It had a certain line. It had militants, many of them really good-hearted and really very active in but did not have the organic relationship to the new dynamics. Now, if I think about the Greek experience, about the movement of the squares, for example, I would suggest that there were two things missing in that area that perhaps would have turned a different process. One was that we did not work as much as we should, especially at the very, very first moments, although all the militants of the left were active in those movements, to make sure that, let's say, the common grievances were going a little bit more directly. I think it was a very important moment, for example, to establish, for example, the rupture with the Eurozone and immediate stoppage to debt payments at the forefront. With debt, it became, stoppage to debt payments became a leitmotif after the movement of the squares. No one could avoid not referring to it, but we should have, if we had done it also with the question of the Eurozone, this would have created a different mentality, balance of force inside the movement. This was one thing that we did not work enough. I'm not saying in the sense of politicizing, in the very traditional leftist way of politicizing, which basically means that there's a nice assembly and there's always the lefty who's going to talk about capitalism and everyone's bored, but everyone says, okay, he's a nice guy, let's hear him and move on. I'm not saying about that. I'm saying in a more organic way, because there were debates going on. This was one thing. The other thing is that what we needed would have been that if there were, let's say, tendencies of the left, for example, tendencies inside of Syriza, the anti-capitalist left, other tendencies at that time, there was the potential to make an appeal for a new formation, a new process of recomposition, not actually in the sense get rid of the other fronts of the left, but actually pose, for example, the question of the unity of the left to a new direction. This would have created, there was a momentum that which would have led us to the post-2011, 2012 sequence with a very different balance of forces, and this in the left, and there was, at that time, the answers were conservative. Most tendencies of the left tended to see things as they would have seen it before. So we missed the opportunity to get all these thousands of people, get them into part of a broader process. Podemos did it. There was this process in Podemos. The formation of Podemos, especially before and right after the European elections of 2014, was a constituent process. The idea that you say, okay, all of us who are against the current situation, let's meet and gather and have an assembly. This was something that we did not do in Greece. And if it were done and had brought together experienced militants, tendencies, Marxist references, etc., of the Greek left with the new dynamic, this would have created something that could have gone further. That's basically how I would describe. The American condition was much, much more different, because it's never simply that a spontaneous movement or something that emerges that it self-transforms into. You need a process of convergence between different histories of struggle, but you need also to think that if there is a point of rupture, you need something that must be novel. It is what Machiavelli thought, this image that fascinated all those intellectuals from Gramsci to Althusser, that you need a new prince without a name initially. Although even Machiavelli was always thinking about a person with a name. So basically this is the game always about whether you achieve this or not. You need something that it has no name, it is new, because it's a new situation, but it also has to come from somewhere, carry on some experience, some historicity behind it. So basically, this is what we missed, and I share part of this responsibility also. I'm not pointing fingers at anyone.
Okay, well, thank you. On behalf of Panagiotis and myself, I want to thank all of you for your engagement tonight at this plenary. And I should announce the spoken word poetry event begins immediately, Josh?
Yes. So